Now, to understand this, I think that you need to consider a moment before all this happened, to consider not just all those graphs, but to understand what the world was like before the 1920s, to understand the institutions through which we lived. And more than any graph, and this is where the economists are going to think I've gone off the rails, but historians will like this. More than any graph, I think that we need to look at a picture. We need to look at a picture that would have hung in any kind of grocer or any kind of shop in an urban area in the late 19th century. This picture right here, because I think it reveals the deeper changes in American society. I sold on credit. I sold in cash. And at first, you just look at that guy and you see him semi-balding, his hair being torn out, and you say, oh, he just had his orals. You know, it's not that hard to understand. But what I urge you to look at here is the way it is the inverse of how we think about credit today, of how we think about cash today, that we think of credit as something that gets more money in the hands of the people at the top. And yet it's the opposite of the lesson here. Look at the man on credit. He's anxious. His coffers are empty. There's rats. Why is he so nervous? Well, it's because when he lent money to his customers, and this would have hung behind the counter at a shop, when he lent money to his customers, he was worried because it was his money at risk. A dollar that he put out on the street or into the accounts of customers who wouldn't pay him back was his money. And his money. And it was very difficult to collect. He couldn't resell that debt. And this is the most important thing to realize, that what is different about credit in the 1920s is the networks that enable the resale of debt. In a limited fashion, we're not talking securitization, but allowing that debt to be resold. And here on the pile on the floor are a bunch of IOUs, and he's worried. In contrast, you have this guy right here. He's fat, he's corpulent, he has some mutton chops that would be the envy of any hipster. Look at those. Those are some pretty sweet chops right there. He's got sushi. I don't know if you can see them in the back. It's not sushi. It's money. You know, all these things. But he's got a nice rug to put on his tables, which is what people used to do. He sold in cash. He sold in cash. This is the opposite world. It's the opposite world. And so he had no one owing him money. He made money by selling, by distributing. And so the question is, how do we get from this world, which is pervasive, and actually still exists in economies that are cut off from these larger circulatory systems of capital? You can get this. I've bought this poster in Thai, where I've seen it in the streets of Bangkok. I've seen it in Spanish in Queens. I've seen it in lots of places, predominantly immigrant neighborhoods, that continue to be cut off from these kinds of movements of capital. Now, why is this the case? It's because it is a bad use of their money. It's a bad use of their money. It's a business decision. It's a business decision about where dollars should and shouldn't go. And yet, this begins to change in the 1920s with the emergence of all those kinds of financial practices like these. General Motors and lots of other finance companies that I write about in my first book are able to start to resell these debts for vacuum cleaners, for everything, all kinds of things. Loans were not commodities to be bought and sold like they are today. It was the inverse.